The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. Octavia bore her rejection silently, lived quietly in Antony's house at Rome, and brought up faithfully his children by Fulvia and the 2 daughters that she herself had given him. The daily sight of her mute desolation inflamed Octavian's conviction that both Italy and he were doomed if Antony's plans succeeded. He saw to it that Italy should realize the situation. Antony had married the Queen of Egypt, had assigned to her and her illegitimate offspring the most tribute-yielding of Rome's provinces, was seeking to make Alexandria the capital of the empire, and would reduce Rome and Italy to subordinate roles. When Antony sent a message to the Senate, which he had for years ignored, proposing that he and Octavian should retire to private life, and that the institutions of the Republic should be restored, Octavian escaped a difficult situation by reading to the Senate what he claimed was Antony's will, which he had taken by force from the Vestal Virgins. It named Antony's children by Cleopatra, his sole heirs, and directed that he should be buried beside the Queen in Alexandria. The last clause was as decisive for the Senate as it should have proved suspicious. Instead of raising doubts that a will filed in Rome should have made such provisions, it convinced the Senate and Italy that Cleopatra was scheming to absorb the empire through Antony. With characteristic subtlety, Octavian declared war in 32 against her, rather than Antony, and made the conflict a holy war for the independence of Italy. In September 32, the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra sailed into the Ionian Sea, 500 warships strong. No such armada had been seen before. Supporting it was an army of 100,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, mostly supplied by Eastern princes and kings in the hope of making this a war of liberation from Rome. Octavian crossed the Adriatic with 400 vessels, 80,000 foot, 12,000 horse. For almost a year the rival forces prepared and maneuvered. Then on September 2, 31, they fought at Actium, in the Ambracian Gulf, one of the decisive battles of history. Agrippa proved the better tactician, and his light ships more manageable than Antony's heavy-towered leviathans. Many of these were consumed by fires set by burning brands cast upon them by Octavian's crews. Some sailors, says Dio Cassius, perished by the smoke before the flames could reach them. Others were cooked in their armor, which became red-hot. Others were roasted in their vessels as though in ovens. Many leaped into the sea. Of these, some were mangled by sea monsters, some were shot by arrows, some were drowned. The only ones to obtain an endurable death were those who killed one another. Antony saw that he was losing and signaled to Cleopatra to carry out their prearranged plan for retreat. She headed her squadron southward and waited for Antony. Unable to extricate his flagship, he abandoned it and rowed out to hers. As they sailed for Alexandria, he sat alone on the prow, his head between his hands, conscious that everything was lost, even honor. From Actium, Octavian went to Athens, thence to Italy to quell a mutiny among his troops, who clamored for the plunder of Egypt, then to Asia to depose and punish Antony's adherents and raise new funds from long-suffering cities, then to Alexandria in 30. Antony had left Cleopatra and was staying on an island near Pharos. Thence he sent offers of peace, which Octavian ignored. Unknown to Antony, Cleopatra sent Octavian a golden scepter, crown, and throne, as tokens of her submission. According to Dio, he replied that he would leave her and Egypt untouched if she would kill Antony. The beaten triumvir wrote to Octavian again, reminding him of their former friendship and of all the wanton pranks in which they had shared as youths, and agreed to kill himself if the victor would spare Cleopatra. Again, Octavian made no reply. Cleopatra gathered all that she could of the Egyptian treasury into a palace tower, and informed Octavian that she would destroy it all and herself, unless he granted an honorable peace. Antony led what small forces remained to him in a last fight. His desperate courage won a temporary victory, but on the next day, seeing Cleopatra's mercenaries surrender, and receiving a report that Cleopatra was dead, he stabbed himself. When he learned that the report was false, he begged to be brought to the tower in whose upper chambers the queen and her attendants had locked themselves. They drew him up through the window, and he died in her arms. Octavian allowed her to come forth and bury her lover. Then he granted her an audience, and, immune to what lure survived in a broken woman of 39, he gave her terms that made life seem worthless to one who had been a queen. Convinced that he intended to take her as captive to adorn a Roman triumph, she arrayed herself in her royal robes, put an asp to her breast, and died. Her handmaidens, Carmian and Iris, followed her in suicide. Octavian permitted her to be buried beside Antony. Caesarion and Antony's eldest son by Fulvia he slew. The children of Antony and the queen he spared and sent to Italy, where Octavia reared them as if they were her own. The victor found the Egyptian treasury intact and as abundant as he had dreamed. Egypt escaped the indignity of being named a Roman province. Octavian merely mounted the throne of the Ptolemies, succeeded to their possessions, and left a praefectus to administer the country in his name. Caesar's heir had conquered those of Alexander and absorbed Alexander's realm. The West, again as at Marathon and Magnesia, had triumphed over the East. The battle of the giants was over, and an invalid had won. The Republic died at Pharsalus. The revolution ended at Actium. Rome had completed the fatal cycle known to Plato and to us: monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchic exploitation, democracy, revolutionary chaos, dictatorship. Once more in the great systole and diastole of history, an age of freedom ended, and an age of discipline began. Book 3. The Principate, 30 B.C. to A.D. 192. Chapter 11. Augustan Statesmanship, 30 B.C. to A.D. 14. 1. The Road to Monarchy. From Alexandria, Octavian passed to Asia and continued the reallotment of kingdoms and provinces. Not till the summer of 29 did he reach Italy. There almost all classes welcomed and feted him as a savior and joined in a triumph that lasted 3 days. The temple of Janus was closed as a sign that for a moment Mars had had his fill. The lusty peninsula was worn out with 20 years of civil war. Its farms had been neglected, its towns had been sacked or besieged, much of its wealth had been stolen or destroyed. Administration and protection had broken down, robbers made every street unsafe at night, highwaymen roamed the roads, kidnapped travelers, and sold them into slavery. Trade diminished, investment stood still, interest rates soared, property values fell. Morals, which had been loosened by riches and luxury, had not been improved by destitution and chaos, for few conditions are more demoralizing than poverty that comes after wealth. Rome was full of men who had lost their economic footing and then their moral stability, soldiers who had tasted adventure and had learned to kill, citizens who had seen their savings consumed in the taxes and inflation of war and waited vacuously for some returning tide to lift them back to affluence, women dizzy with freedom, multiplying divorces, abortions, and adulteries. Childlessness was spreading as the ideal of a declining vitality, and a shallow sophistication prided itself upon its pessimism and cynicism. This was not a full picture of Rome, but a dangerous disease burning in its blood. On the sea, piracy had returned, rejoicing in the suicide of states. Cities and provinces licked their wounds after the successive exactions of Sulla, Lucullus, Pompey, Gabinius, Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Octavian. Greece, which had been the battlefield, was ruined. Egypt was despoiled. The Near East had fed 100 armies and bribed 1,000 generals. Their peoples hated Rome as a master who had destroyed their freedom without giving them security or peace. What if some leader should arise among them, discover the exhaustion of Italy, and unite them in another war of liberation against Rome? Once a virile senate would have faced these dangers, raised sturdy legions, found for them able captains, and guided them with far-seeing statesmanship. But the senate was now only a name. The great families that had been its strength had died out in conflict or sterility, and the traditions of statecraft had not been transmitted to the businessmen, soldiers, and provincials who had succeeded them. The new Senate gratefully yielded its major powers to one who would plan, take responsibility, and lead. Octavian hesitated before abolishing the old constitution, and Dio Cassius represents him as discussing the matter at great length with Maecenas and Agrippa. Since in their judgment all governments were oligarchies, the problem could not present itself to them as a choice among monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. They had to decide whether, under the given conditions of space and time, oligarchy was to be preferred in a monarchical form based upon an army, or an aristocratic form rooted in heredity, or a democratic form resting on the wealth of the business class. Octavian combined them all in a principate that mingled the theories of Cicero, the precedents of Pompey, and the policies of Caesar. The people accepted his solution philosophically. They were no longer enamored of freedom, but wearily wished for security and order. Any man might rule them who guaranteed them games and bread. Vaguely they understood that their clumsy comitia, clogged with corruption and racked with violence, could not govern the empire, could not restore health to Italy, could not even administer Rome. The difficulties of freedom multiply with the area it embraces. When Rome ceased to be a city-state, empire drove it inexorably toward the imitation of Egypt, Persia, and Macedon. Out of the collapse of freedom into individualism and chaos, a new government had to be created to forge a new order for a widened realm. All the Mediterranean world lay in disorder at Octavian's feet, waiting for statesmanship. He succeeded where Caesar had failed because he was more patient and devious, because he understood the strategy of words and forms, because he was willing to move cautiously and slowly where his great-uncle had been forced by the brevity of time to wound living traditions and crowd a generation of changes into half a year of life. Moreover, Octavian had money. When he brought the treasury of Egypt to Rome, says Suetonius, money became so abundant that the interest rate fell from 12 to 4%, and the value of real estate rose enormously. As soon as Octavian made it clear that property rights were again sacred, that he was through with proscriptions and confiscations, money came out of hiding, investment took courage, trade expanded, wealth resumed its accumulation, and some of it trickled down to the workers and the slaves. All ranks in Italy were pleased to learn that Italy was to remain the beneficiary and Rome the capital of the empire, that the threat of a resurrected East had for a time been laid, and that Caesar's dream of a commonwealth with equal rights had been replaced by a quiet return to the privileges of the master race. From this bountiful rapine, Octavian first paid his debts to his soldiers. He kept 200,000 men in service, each bound to him by an oath of personal loyalty. The remaining 300,000 he discharged with an allotment of agricultural land, and to each soldier he gave a substantial gift of money. He lavished presents upon his generals, his supporters, and his friends. On several occasions he made up deficits in the public treasury from his private funds. To provinces suffering from political depredations or acts of God he remitted a year's tribute and sent large sums for relief. He forgave property owners all tax arrears and publicly burned the records of their debts to the state. He paid for the corn dole, provided prodigal spectacles and games, and presented cash to every citizen. He undertook great public works to end unemployment and beautify Rome, and paid for them out of his purse. Was it any wonder that the nations looked upon him as a god? While all this money slipped through his hands, this bourgeois empereur lived simply, shunning the luxuries of the nobles and the emoluments of office, wearing the garments woven by the women in his home, and sleeping always in one small room of what had been the palace of Hortensius. When this burned down after he had occupied it for 28 years, he built his new palace on the plan of the old, and slept in the same narrow cubiculum as before. Even when away from the eyes of the city, he lived like a philosopher rather than a prince. His sole indulgence was to escape from public affairs by sailing leisurely along the Campanian coast. Step by step he persuaded, or graciously permitted, the Senate and the assemblies to grant him powers that in their total made him in all but name a king. He kept always the title of Imperator, as commander-in-chief of all the armed forces of the state. As the army remained for the most part outside the capital and usually outside Italy, the citizens could forget, while they went through all the forms of the dead republic, that they were living under a military monarchy in which force was hidden so long as phrases could rule. Octavian was chosen consul in 43 and 33, and in every year from 31 to 23. By the tribunician authority conferred upon him in 36, 30, and 23, he had for life the inviolability of a tribune, the right to initiate legislation in the Senate or the Assembly, and the power to veto the actions of any official in the government. No one protested against this amiable dictatorship. The businessmen who were making hay under the sun of peace, the senators who sniffed Octavian's Egyptian spoils, the soldiers who held their lands or status by his bounty, the beneficiaries of Caesar's laws, appointments, and will, all were now agreed with Homer that the rule of one man is best, at least if he should be so free with his funds as Octavian, so industrious and competent, and so visibly devoted to the good of the state. In 28, as co-censor with Agrippa, he took a census of the people, revised the membership of the Senate, reduced it to 600, and was himself named permanently Princeps Senatus. The title had meant first on the roll call of the Senate. Soon it would mean prince, in the sense of ruler, just as imperator, through Octavian's life tenure of the name, would come to mean emperor. History rightly calls his government, and that of his successors for 2 centuries, a principate rather than strictly a monarchy. For until the death of Commodus, all the emperors recognized, at least in theory, that they were only the leaders, or principes, of the Senate. To make the constitutional facade of his authority more imposing, Octavian in 27 surrendered all his offices, proclaimed the restoration of the Republic, and expressed his desire, at 35, to retire to private life. Perhaps the drama had been arranged. Octavian was one of those cautious men who believe that honesty is the best policy, but that it must be practiced with discrimination. The Senate countered his abdication with its own, returned to him nearly all his powers, implored him to continue his guidance of the state, and conferred upon him the title of Augustus, which history has mistaken as his name. Hitherto the word had been applied only to holy objects and places, and to certain creative or augmenting divinities, from augere, to increase. Applied to Octavian, it clothed him with the halo of sanctity and the protection of religion and the gods. The people of Rome seemed to have thought for a while that the restoration was real, and that they were receiving back the Republic in return for an adjective. Did not the Senate and the assemblies still make the laws, still elect the magistrates? It was so. Augustus or his agents merely proposed the laws and nominated the more important candidates. As imperator and consul, he ruled the army and the treasury and administered the laws, and by his tribunician privileges he controlled all other activities of the government. His powers were not much greater than those of Pericles or Pompey, or any energetic American president. The difference lay in their permanence. In 23 he resigned the consulate, but received from the Senate a proconsular authority that gave him control of all officials in all provinces. Again, no one objected. On the contrary, when a scarcity of grain threatened, the people besieged the Senate with demands that Augustus be made dictator. They had fared so ill under the senatorial oligarchy that they were inclined toward a dictatorship which would presumably cultivate their favor as a foil to the power of wealth. Augustus refused, but he took charge of the annona, or food supply, quickly ended the shortage, and earned such gratitude that Rome looked on with complacency as he remolded its institutions in his image. 2. The New Order. Let us study this Principate government in some detail, for in many ways it was one of the subtlest political achievements in history. The powers of the prince were at once legislative, executive, and judicial. He could propose laws or decrees to assemblies or senate, he could administer and enforce them, he could interpret them, he could penalize their violation. Augustus, says Suetonius, regularly sat as a judge, sometimes till nightfall, having a litter placed upon the tribunal if he was indisposed. He was highly conscientious and very lenient. Bearing the duties of so many offices, Augustus organized an informal cabinet of counselors like Maecenas, executives like Agrippa, generals like Tiberius, and an incipient clerical and administrative bureaucracy, chiefly composed of his freedmen and slaves. Caius Maecenas was a wealthy businessman who devoted half his life to helping Augustus in war and peace, in politics and diplomacy, at last, unwillingly, in love. His palace on the Esquiline was famous for its gardens and its swimming pool of heated water. His enemies described him as an effeminate Epicurean, for he flaunted silks and gems and knew all the lore of a Roman gourmet. He enjoyed and generously patronized literature and art, restored Virgil's farm to him and gave another to Horace, inspired the Georgics and the Odes. He refused public office, though he might have had almost any. He labored for years over principles and details of administration and foreign policy. He had the courage to reprove Augustus when he thought him seriously wrong, and when he died in 8 BC the prince mourned his losses beyond repair. Perhaps it was on his advice that Augustus, himself of middle-class origin and free from the aristocrats' contempt of trade, named so many businessmen to high administrative posts, even to provincial governorships. To a Senate offended by this innovation he made amends by many obeisances, by giving exceptional powers to senatorial commissions, and by gathering about him a concilium principis of some 20 men, nearly all senators. In the course of time the decisions of this council acquired the force of senatus consulta, or decrees of the Senate. Its powers and functions grew as those of the Senate waned. However he might lavish courtesies upon it, the Senate was merely his highest instrument. As censor he 4 times revised its membership. He could and did eject individuals from it for official incompetence or private immorality. Most of its new members were nominated by him, and the quaestors, praetors, and consuls who entered it after their term of office had been chosen by him or with his consent. The richest businessmen of Italy were enrolled in the Senate, and the 2 orders were in some measure brought together in that concordia of united domination which Cicero had proposed. The power of wealth checked the pride and privilege of birth, and an hereditary aristocracy checked the abuses and irresponsibility of wealth. At the suggestion of Augustus, the meetings of the Senate were confined to the 1st and 15th of each month, and usually lasted but a day. As the Princeps Senatus presided, no measure could be submitted without his consent, and in fact all measures presented had been prepared by himself or his aides. The judicial and executive functions of the Senate now outweighed its lawmaking. It served as a supreme court, governed Italy through commissions, and directed the performance of various public works. It ruled those provinces which required no extensive military control, but foreign relations were now controlled by the prince. Shorn in this way of its ancient authority, the Senate grew negligent in even its limited functions, and yielded ever more responsibility to the emperor and his staff. The assemblies still met, though with decreasing frequency. They still voted, but only on measures or nominations approved by the prince. The right of the plebs to hold office was practically ended in 18 BC by a law restricting office to men having a fortune of 400,000 sesterces, or $60,000, or more. Augustus ran for the consulate 13 times and canvassed for votes like the rest. It was a gracious concession to dramatic technique. Corruption was hindered by requiring every candidate to deposit before election a financial guarantee that he would abstain from bribery. Augustus himself, however, once distributed 1,000 sesterces to each voting member of his tribe to make sure that its vote would be correct. Tribunes and consuls continued to be elected till the 5th century A.D., but as their major powers had fallen to the prince, these offices were administrative rather than executive, and finally became mere dignitaries. The actual government of Rome was placed by Augustus in the hands of salaried regional officials, equipped with a force of 3,000 police under a praefectus urbi, or municipal police commissioner. Further to assure order of the desired kind and support his own power, Augustus, seriously violating precedent, kept 6 cohorts of 1,000 soldiers each near Rome, and 3 cohorts within it. These 9 cohorts became the Praetorian Guard, that is, Guard of the Praetorium, or headquarters of the commander-in-chief. It was this body that in A.D. 41 made Claudius emperor and began the subjection of the government to the army. From Rome, the administrative care of Augustus passed to Italy and the provinces. He conferred Roman citizenship, or the limited franchise of Latin rights, upon all Italian communities that had borne their share in the war against Egypt. He helped the Italian cities with gifts, embellished them with new buildings, and devised a plan whereby their local councillors might vote by mail in the assembly elections at Rome. He divided the provinces into 2 classes, those that required active defense and those that did not. The latter, Sicily, Baetica, Narbonese Gaul, Macedonia, Achaia, Asia Minor, Bithynia, Pontus, Cyprus, Crete, and Cyrene, and North Africa, he allowed the Senate to rule. The others, imperial provinces, were governed by his own legates, procurators, or prefects. This pleasant arrangement allowed him to keep control of the army, which was mostly quartered in the endangered provinces. It gave him the lush revenue of Egypt, and it enabled him to keep an eye on the senatorial governors through the procurators whom he appointed to collect the tribute in all the provinces. Each governor now received a fixed salary, so that his temptation to mulct his subjects was moderately reduced. Furthermore, a body of civil servants provided a continuing administration and a check upon the malfeasance of their temporary superiors. The kinglets of client states were treated with wise courtesy and gave Augustus full allegiance. He persuaded most of them to send their sons to live in his palace and receive a Roman education. By this generous arrangement, the youths served as hostages until their accession, and then as unwitting vehicles of Romanization. In the flush aftermath of Actium, and possessed of an enormous army and navy, Augustus apparently planned to extend the empire to the Atlantic, the Sahara, the Euphrates, the Black Sea, the Danube, and the Elbe. The Pax Romana was to be maintained not by passive defense, but by an aggressive policy on every frontier. The emperor in person completed the conquest of Spain, and so ably reorganized the administration of Gaul that it remained at peace for nearly a century. In the case of Parthia, he contented himself with the return of the standards and surviving captives taken from Crassus in 53. But he restored to the throne of Armenia a Tigranes favorable to Rome. He sent abortive expeditions to conquer Ethiopia and Arabia. In the decade from 19 to 9 B.C., his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus subjugated Illyria, Pannonia, and Rhaetia. Agreeably provoked by German invasions of Gaul, Augustus ordered Drusus to cross the Rhine and rejoiced to learn that the brilliant youth had fought his way to the Elbe. But Drusus suffered internal injuries from a fall, lingered in pain for 30 days, and died. Tiberius, who loved Drusus with all the intensity of a restrained but passionate nature, rode 400 miles on horseback from Gaul into Germany to hold his brother in his arms in the final hours. Then he conveyed the body to Rome, walking before the cortege all the way, this in 9 B.C. Returning to Germany, Tiberius in 2 campaigns, from 8 to 7 B.C. and from A.D. 4 to 5, forced the submission of the tribes between the Elbe and the Rhine. 2 disasters coming almost together changed this fever of expansion into a policy of peace. In A.D. 6, the lately won provinces of Pannonia and Dalmatia revolted, massacred all the Romans in their territory, organized an army of 200,000 men, and threatened to invade Italy. Tiberius quickly made peace with the German tribes and led his depleted forces into Pannonia. With patient and ruthless strategy, he captured or destroyed the crops that could supply the enemy, and by guerrilla warfare prevented new plantings, while he saw to it that his own troops were well fed. For 3 years he persisted in this policy despite universal criticism at home. At last he had the satisfaction of seeing the starving rebels disband and of re-establishing the Roman power. But in that same year, A.D. 9, Arminius organized a revolt in Germany, lured the 3 legions of Varus, the Roman governor, into a trap and killed every man of them except those who, like Varus, fell upon their own swords. When Augustus heard of this, he was so deeply affected, says Suetonius, that for several months he cut neither his beard nor his hair, and sometimes he would dash his head against a door and cry out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Tiberius hastened to Germany, reorganized the army there, stood off the Germans, and, by Augustus's orders, withdrew the Roman boundary to the Rhine. It was a decision costly to the emperor's pride, but creditable to his judgment. Germany was surrendered to barbarism, that is, to a non-classic culture, and was left free to arm its growing population against Rome. However, the same reasons that had argued for the conquest of Germany would have demanded the subjection of Scythia, southern Russia. Somewhere the empire had to stop, and the Rhine was a better frontier than any other west of the Urals. Having annexed northern and western Spain, Rhaetia, Noricum, Pannonia, Moesia, Galatia, Lycia, and Pamphylia, Augustus felt that he had sufficiently earned his title of the Increasing God. At his death, the empire covered 3,340,000 square miles, more than the mainland of the United States, and over 100 times the area of Rome before the Punic Wars. Augustus advised his successor to be content with this, the greatest empire yet seen, to seek rather to unite and strengthen it within than to extend it without. He expressed his surprise that Alexander did not regard it as a greater risk to set in order the empire that he had won than to win it. The Pax Romana had begun. 3. Saturnia Regna. It could not be said that Augustus had made a desert and called it peace. Within a decade after Actium, the Mediterranean knew such economic quickening as no tradition could parallel. The restoration of order was in itself a stimulus to recovery. The renewed safety of the seas, the stability of government, the conservatism of Augustus, the consumption of Egypt's hoarded treasure, the opening of new mines and mints, the reliability and accelerated circulation of the currency, the easing of congested population into agricultural allotments and colonial settlements. How could prosperity resist so unanimous an invitation? A group of Alexandrian sailors, landing at Puteoli when Augustus was nearby, approached him in festal dress and offered him incense as to a deity. It was because of him, they said, that they could voyage in safety, trade in confidence, and live in peace. Augustus was convinced, as became the grandson of a banker, that the best economy was one that united freedom with security. He protected all classes with well-administered laws, guarded the highways of trade, lent money without interest to responsible landowners, and mollified the poor with state grain, lotteries, and occasional gifts. For the rest, he left enterprise, production, and exchange freer than before. Even so, the works directed by the state were now of unprecedented magnitude, and played some part in restoring economic life. 82 temples were built. A new forum and basilica were added to facilitate the operations of finance and the courts. A new senate house replaced the one that had incinerated Clodius. Colonnades were erected to temper the sun. The theater that Caesar had begun was completed and named after Marcellus, son-in-law of Augustus. And rich men were prodded by the emperor into spending part of their fortunes in adorning Italy with basilicas, temples, libraries, theaters, and roads. Those that celebrated triumphs, says Dio Cassius, he commanded to erect out of their spoils some public work to commemorate their deeds. Augustus hoped to make the majesty of Rome enhance and symbolize her power and his own. Toward the close of his life, he remarked that he had found Rome a city of brick and had left it a city of marble. It was a forgivable exaggeration. There had been much marble there before, and much brick remained. But seldom had any man done so much for a city. His indispensable aid in the reconstruction of Rome was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. This perfect friend had shared with Maecenas the guidance of Augustus's policy. In his year as aedile, 33 B.C., Agrippa had won the public to Octavian by opening 170 public baths, distributing free oil and salt, presenting games for 55 successive days, and providing free barbers for all citizens for a year, apparently all at his own expense. His ability might have made him another Caesar. He preferred to serve Augustus for a generation. So far as we know, his life was unstained by public or private scandal. Roman gossip, which sooner or later besmirched everyone else, left him untouched. He was the first Roman to realize the importance of sea power. He planned, built, and commanded the fleet, defeated Sextus Pompey, suppressed piracy, and won a world for Augustus at Actium. After these victories and his pacification of Spain, Gaul, and the Bosporan kingdom, he was thrice offered a triumph and always refused. Enriched by a grateful prince, he continued to live without luxury, and devoted himself as ardently to public works as he had done to the preservation of the state. Out of his own purse he hired hundreds of laborers to repair roads, buildings, and sewers, and reopen the Martian aqueduct. He constructed a new aqueduct, the Julian, and further improved the water supply of Rome with 700 wells, 500 fountains, and 130 reservoirs. When the people complained of the high price of wine, Augustus slyly remarked, "My son-in-law Agrippa has seen to it that Rome shall not go thirsty." This greatest of Roman engineers created a spacious harbor and shipbuilding center by connecting the Lucrine and Avernian lakes with the sea. He built the first of the imposing public baths that were to distinguish Rome among the cities. He constructed, again out of his own funds, a temple to Venus and Mars, which was rebuilt by Hadrian, is known to us as the Pantheon, and still bears on its portico the words M. Agrippa Fecit. He organized a 30-year survey of the empire, wrote a treatise on geography, and made in painted marble a map of the world. Like Leonardo, he was a scientist, an engineer, an inventor of military projectiles, and an artist. His early death at the age of 50 in 12 BC was among the many sorrows that darkened the later years of Augustus, who had given him his daughter Julia in marriage and had hoped to bequeath the empire to him as the man best fitted to govern it honestly and well. Costly public works combined with extended governmental services to raise state expenditures beyond precedent. Salaries were now paid to provincial and municipal officials, bureaucrats, and police. A large army and navy were maintained. Buildings were put up or restored without number. Corn and games bribed the populace to peace. Since expenses were met out of current revenue and no national debt was laid upon the future, taxation under Augustus became a science and an unremitting industry. Augustus was not relentless. Often he forgave taxes to harassed individuals and cities or paid them out of his personal funds. He returned to the municipalities 35,000 pounds of gold offered him as a coronation gift on the occasion of his 5th consulate, and he refused many other donations. He abolished the land tax laid upon Italy in the Civil War. In its stead, he levied upon all citizens in the empire a 5% tax on bequests to any persons except near relatives and the poor. A tax of 1% was placed upon auction sales, 4% upon the sale of slaves, 5% upon their manumission, and custom dues from 2.5% to 5% were collected on nearly all ports of entry. All citizens were subject also to municipal taxes, and Roman realty did not share in Italy's exemption from the tax on land. Taxes were paid for water supplied from the public mains. Considerable revenue came from the leasing of public lands, mines, and fisheries, from the state monopoly of salt, and the fines imposed by the courts. The provinces paid a tributum soli, or land tax, and a tributum capitis, literally a head or poll tax, actually a tax on personal property. Taxes flowed into 2 coffers at Rome, both stored in temples, the national treasury, or aerarium, controlled by the Senate, and the imperial treasury, or fiscus, owned and managed by the emperor. To the latter came the income not only from his vast personal properties, but bequests from well-wishers and friends. Such legacies in the lifetime of Augustus amounted to 1,400,000,000 sesterces. All in all, taxation under the Principate was not oppressive, and until Commodus, the results were worth the cost. The provinces prospered and raised altars of gratitude or expectation to Augustus the god. Even in sophisticated Rome, he had to censure the people for the extravagance of their eulogies. One enthusiast ran through the streets calling upon men and women to devote themselves to Augustus, that is, promised to kill themselves when he died. In 2 BC, Messala Corvinus, who had captured Octavian's camp at Philippi, proposed that the title of Pater Patriae should be conferred upon Augustus. The Senate, pleased to have so little responsibility while retaining honors and wealth, gladly heaped upon the emperor this and other titles of praise. The business classes, now richer than ever, celebrated his birthday with a 2-day festival year after year. All sorts and conditions of men, says Suetonius, brought him gifts on the calends of January, New Year's Day. When fire destroyed his old palace, every city, apparently every tribe and guild in the empire, sent him a contribution to rebuild it. He refused to take more than a denarius from any individual, but nevertheless he had more than enough. All the Mediterranean world, after its long ordeal, seemed happy, and Augustus might believe that his patience and labor had accomplished his great task. 4. The Augustan Reformation. He destroyed his own happiness by trying to make people good as well as happy. It was an imposition that Rome never forgave him. Moral reform is the most difficult and delicate branch of statesmanship. Few rulers have dared to attempt it. Most rulers have left it to hypocrites and saints. Augustus began modestly enough by seeking to check the racial transformation of Rome. Population there was not declining. On the contrary, it was growing by mass and dole attraction and the import of wealth and slaves. Since freedmen were included in the dole, many citizens freed old or sickly slaves to have them fed by the state. Kinder motives freed more, and many slaves saved enough to buy their liberty. As the sons of freedmen automatically became citizens, the emancipation of slaves and the fertility of aliens combined with the low birth rate of the native stocks to change the ethnic character of Rome. Augustus wondered what stability there could be in so heterogeneous a population, and what loyalty to the empire might be expected of men in whose veins ran the blood of subject peoples. By his urging, the Lex Fufia Caninia, 2 BC, and later measures enacted that an owner of not more than 2 slaves might free them all, the owner of from 3 to 10 slaves might free half of them, the owner of from 11 to 30, 1/3, the owner of from 31 to 100, 1/4, the owner of from 101 to 300, 1/5, and no master might free more than 100. One might wish that Augustus had limited slavery instead of freedom, but antiquity took slavery for granted and would have contemplated with horror the economic and social effects of a wholesale emancipation, just as the employers of our time fear the sloth that might come from security. Augustus was thinking in terms of race and class. He could not conceive a strong Rome without the character, courage, and political ability that had marked the old Roman. Above all, the old aristocracy. The decay of the ancient faith among the upper classes had washed away the supernatural supports of marriage, fidelity, and parentage. The passage from farm to city had made children less of an asset, more of a liability and a toy. Women wished to be sexually rather than maternally beautiful. In general, the desire for individual freedom seemed to be running counter to the needs of the race. To accentuate the evil, legacy hunting had become the most profitable occupation in Italy. Men without children were sure to be courted in their declining years by expectant ghouls, and so large a number of Romans relished this esurient courtesy that it became an added cause of childlessness. Protracted military service drew a considerable proportion of young men from marriage in their most nubile years. A large number of native stock Romans avoided wedlock altogether, preferring prostitutes or concubines even to a varied succession of wives. Of those who married, a majority appear to have limited their families by abortion, infanticide, coitus interruptus, and contraception. Augustus was disturbed by these insignia of civilization. He began to feel that a movement backward to the old faith and morals was necessary. Respect for the mos maiorum revived in him as the years cleared his vision and tired his frame. It was not good, he felt, for the present to break too sharply with the past. A nation must have a continuity of traditions to be sane, as a man must have a memory. He read with aging seriousness the historians of Rome and envied the virtues they ascribed to the ancients. He relished the speech of Quintus Metellus on marriage, read it to the Senate, and recommended it to the people by imperial proclamation. A large part of the older generation agreed with him. It formed a kind of Puritan party eager to reform morals by law, and probably Livia lent them her influence. By his powers as censor and tribune, Augustus promulgated, or passed through the assembly, a series of laws of now uncertain date and sequence aimed at restoring morals, marriage, fidelity, parentage, and a simpler life. They forbade adolescents to attend public entertainments except in the company of an adult relative, excluded women from athletic exhibitions and restricted them to the upper seats at gladiatorial games, limited expenditure on homes, servants, banquets, weddings, jewels, and dress. The most important of these Julian laws, so named after the clan to which Augustus belonged by adoption, was the Lex Julia de Pudicitia e de Coercendis Adulteris, 18 BC, the Julian law of chastity and repressing adultery. Here, for the first time in Roman history, marriage was brought under the protection of the state instead of being left to the patria potestas. The father retained the right to kill an adulterous daughter and her accomplice as soon as he discovered them. The husband was allowed to kill his wife's paramour if caught in the husband's house, but he might kill his wife only if he found her sinning in his own home. Within 60 days of detecting a wife's adultery, the husband was required to bring her before the court. If he failed to do this, the woman's father was required to indict her. If he too failed, any citizen might accuse her. The adulterous woman was to be banished for life, was to lose 1/3 of her fortune and half her dowry, and must not marry again. Like penalties were decreed for a husband conniving at his wife's adultery. A wife, however, could not accuse her husband of adultery, and he might with legal impunity have relations with registered prostitutes. The law applied only to Roman citizens. Probably at the same time, Augustus passed another law, usually named Lex Julia de Meritandis Ordinibus, from its chapter on marriage in the Orders, that is, the two upper classes. Its purpose was threefold: to encourage and yet restrict marriage, to retard the dilution of Roman with alien blood, and to restore the old conception of marriage as a union for parentage. Marriage was to be obligatory upon all marriageable males under 60 and women under 50. Bequests conditional on the legatee remaining unmarried were made void. Penalties were imposed upon celibates. They could not inherit except from relatives unless they were married within 100 days after the testator's death. They could not attend public festivals or games. Widows and divorcees might inherit only if remarried within 6 months after the death or divorce of the husband. Spinsters and childless wives could not inherit after 50, nor before if they possessed 50,000 sesterces, or $7,500. Men of the senatorial class could not marry a freedwoman, an actress, or a prostitute, and no actor or freedman could marry a senator's daughter. Women owning above 20,000 sesterces were to pay a 1% annual tax till married. After marriage, this tax decreased with each child until the third, with whose coming it ceased. Of the two consuls, the one with more children was to have precedence over the other. In appointments to office, the father of the largest family was as far as feasible to be preferred to his rivals. The mother of 3 children acquired the jus trium liberorum, the right to wear a special garment, and freedom from the power of her husband. These laws offended every class, even the Puritans, who complained that the right of 3 children dangerously emancipated the mother from male authority. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.